What else is the purpose of life? Perhaps to have an opportunity to mull over his strange theories, Tuttle soon retired to an inactivation nook in the wall beneath the metal shelf on which the guns lay. He slid in feet first and pulled the hatch shut behind his head, leaving the others to their own devices. 15 minutes later, Leek said, "I believe I'll follow Tuttle's example. I need time to consider my responses to this afternoon's hunt." Koontz knew that Leek was only making excuses to be gone. He was not a particularly gregarious robot, and seemed most comfortable when he was ignored and left to himself. Alone with Stefan in the lodge, Koontz was in an unpleasantly delicate position. He felt that he, too, needed time to think inside a deactivation nook. However, he did not want to hurt Stefan's feelings, and did not want to give him the impression that they were all anxious to be away from him. For the most part, Koontz liked the young robot. Stefan was fresh, energetic, obviously a first-line mentality. The only thing he found grating about the youth was his innocence, his undisciplined drive to be accepted and to achieve. Time, of course, would mellow Stefan and hone his mind, so he did not deserve to be hurt. How, then, to excuse oneself without slighting Stefan in any way? The younger robot solved the problem by suggesting that he, too, needed time in a nook. When Stefan was safely shut away, Koontz went to the fourth of the 5 wall slots, slid into it, pulled the hatch shut, and felt all of his senses drain away from him, so that he was only a mind, floating in darkness, contemplating the wealth of ideas in his data vault. Adrift in nothingness, Koontz considers the superstition that has begun to be the center of this adventure, the human being, the man. 1. Though of flesh, the man thinks and knows. 2. He sleeps by night, like an animal. 3. He devours other flesh, as does the beast. 4. He defecates. 5. He dies and rots, is susceptible to disease and corruption. 6. He spawns his young in a terrifyingly unmechanical way, and yet his young are also sentient. 7. He kills. 8. He can overpower a robot. 9. He dismantles robots, though none but other men know what he does with their parts. 10. He is the antithesis of the robot. If the robot represents the proper way of life, man is the improper. 11. Man stalks in safety, registering to the robot's senses, unless clearly seen, as only another harmless animal, until it is too late. 12. He can be permanently killed only with a wooden implement. Wood is the product of an organic life form, yet it lasts as metal does. Halfway between flesh and metal, it can destroy human flesh. 13. If killed in any other way, by any means other than wood, the man will only appear to be dead. In reality, the moment that he drops before his assailant, he at once springs to life elsewhere, unharmed, in a new body. Although the list goes on, Koontz abandons that avenue of thought, for it disturbs him deeply. Tuttle's fantasy can be nothing more than that: conjecture, supposition, imagination. If the human being actually existed, how could one believe the Central Agency's prime rule, that the universe is, in every way, entirely logical and rational? "The rifles are gone," Tuttle said when Koontz slid out of the deactivation nook and got to his feet. "Gone. All of them. That's why I've recalled you." "Gone?" Koontz asked, looking at the shelf where the weapons had been. "Gone where?" "Leek's taken them," Stefan said. He stood by the window, his long bluish arms beaded with cold droplets of water precipitated out of the air. "Is Leek gone too?" Kurinov asked. "Yes." He thought about this, then said, "But where would he go in the storm? And why would he need all the rifles?" "I'm sure it's nothing to be concerned about," Stefan said. "He must have had a good reason, and he can tell us all about it when he comes back." Tuttle said, "If he comes back." Kurinov said, "Tuttle, you sound as if you think he might be in danger." "In light of what's happened recently, those prints we found, I'd say that could be a possibility." Stefan scoffed at this. "Whatever's happening," Tuttle said, "you must admit it's odd." He turned to Kurinov. "I wish we hadn't submitted to the operations before we came out here. I'd do anything to have my full senses again." He hesitated. "I think we have to find Leek." "He'll be back," Stefan argued. "He'll return when he wants to return." "I'm still in favor of initiating a search," Tuttle said. Kurinov went to the window and stood next to Stefan, gazing out at the driving snow. The ground was covered with at least 12 inches of new powder. The proud trees had been bowed under the white weight, and snow continued to fall faster than Kurinov had ever seen it in all his many journeys. "Well?" Tuttle asked again. "I concur," Kurinov said. "We should look for him, but we should do it together. With our lessened perceptions, we might easily get separated and lost out there. If one of us became damaged in a fall, he might experience a complete battery depletion before anyone found him." "You're right," Tuttle said. He turned to Stefan. "And you?" "Oh, all right," Stefan said crossly. "I'll come along." Their torches cut bright wounds in the darkness, but did little to melt through the curtain of wind-driven snow. They walked abreast around the lodge, continuing a circle search. Each time that they completed another turn about the building, they widened their search pattern. They decided to cover all the open land, but they would not enter the forest even if they hadn't located Leek elsewhere. They agreed to this limitation, though none, not even Stefan, admitted that half the reason for ignoring the woods was a purely irrational fear of what might live among the trees. In the end, however, it was not necessary to enter the woods, for they found Leek less than 20 yards away from the lodge. He was lying on his side in the snow. "He's been terminated," Stefan said. The others didn't need to be told. Both of Leek's legs were missing. "Who could have done something like this?" Stefan asked. Neither Tuttle nor Kurinov answered him. Leek's head hung limply on his neck, because several of the links in his ring cable had been bent out of alignment. His visual receptors had been smashed, and the mechanism behind them ripped out through the shattered sockets. When Kurinov bent closer, he saw that someone had poked a sharp object into Leek's data vaults, through his eye tubes, and scrambled his tapes into a useless mess. He hoped that poor Leek had been dead by then. "Horrible," Stefan said. He turned away from the grisly scene, began to walk back to the lodge, but stopped abruptly as he realized that he should not be out of the other robot's company. He shuddered mentally. "What should we do with him?" Tuttle asked. "Leave him," Kurinov said. "Here to rust?" "He'll sense nothing more." "Still, we should be getting back," Kurinov said, shining his light around the snowy scene. "We shouldn't expose ourselves." Keeping close to one another, they returned to the lodge. As they walked, Kurinov reviewed certain disturbing data. 9. He dismantles robots, though none but other men know what he does with their parts. As I see it, Kurnov told them when they were once again in the lodge. Leek did not take the rifles. Someone, or something, entered the lodge to steal them. Leek must have come out of his inactivation nook just as the culprits were leaving. Without pausing to wake us, he gave chase. Or was forced to go with them, Tuttle said. I doubt that he was taken out by force, Kurnov said. In the lodge, with enough light to see by and enough space to maneuver in, even with lessened perceptions, Leek could have kept himself from being hurt or forced to leave. However, once he was outside, in the storm, he was at their mercy. The wind screamed across the peaked roof of the lodge, rattled the windows in their metal frames. The 3 remaining robots stood still, listening until the gust died away, as though the noise were made not by the wind, but by some enormous beast that had reared up over the building and was intent on tearing it to pieces. Kurnov went on. When I examined Leek, I found that he was felled by a sharp blow to the ring cable, just under the head. The kind of blow that would have had to come suddenly from behind and without warning. In a room as well lighted as this, nothing could have gotten behind Leek without his knowing it was there. Stefan turned away from the window and said, Do you think that Leek was already terminated when— His voice trailed away, but in a moment he had found the discipline to go on. Was he terminated when they dismantled his legs? We can only hope that he was, Kurnov said. Stefan said, Who could have done such a thing? A man, Tuttle said. Or men, Kurnov amended. No, Stefan said, but his denial was not as adamant as it had been before. What would they have done with his legs? No one knows what they do with what they take, Kurnov said. Stefan said, You sound as if Tuttle's convinced you, as if you believe in these creatures. Until I have a better answer to the question of who terminated Leek, I think it's safest to believe in human beings, Kurnov explained. For a time, they were silent. Then Kurnov said, I think we should start back to Walker's Watch in the morning, first thing. They'll think we're immature, Stefan said, if we come back with wild tales about men prowling around the lodge in the darkness. You saw how disdainful Janus was of others who had made similar reports. We have poor dead Leek as proof, Tuttle said. Or, Kurnov said, we can say Leek was terminated in an accident, and we're returning because we're bored with the challenge. You mean we wouldn't even have to mention human beings? Stefan asked. Possibly, Kurnov said. That would be the best way to handle it by far, Stefan said. Then no second-hand reports of our temporary irrationality would get back to the agency. We could spend much time in the inactivation nooks until we finally were able to perceive the real explanation of Leek's termination, which somehow now eludes us. If we meditate long enough, a proper solution is bound to arise. Then, by the time of our next data vault audits by the agency, we'll have covered all traces of this illogical reaction from which we now suffer. However, Tuttle said, we might already know the real story of Leek's death. After all, we've seen the footprints in the snow, and we've seen the dismantled body. Could it be that men, human beings, really are behind it? No, Stefan said. That's superstitious nonsense. That's irrational. At dawn, Kurnov said, we'll set out for Walker's Watch, no matter how bad the storm is by then. As he finished speaking, the distant hum of the lodge generator, which was a comforting background noise that never abated, abruptly cut out. They were plunged into darkness. With snow crusted on their chilled metal skins, they focused 3 electric torches on the compact generator in its niche behind the lodge. The top of the machine casing had been removed, exposing the complex inner works to the elements. "Someone's removed the power core," Koontz said. "But who?" Stefan asked. Koontz directed the beam of his torch to the ground. The others did likewise. Mingled with their own footprints were other prints similar to but not made by any robot. Those same strange tracks that they had seen near the trees in the late afternoon. The same tracks that profusely marked the snow all around Leek's body. "No," Stefan said. "No, no, no." "I think it's best that we set out for Walker's Watch tonight," Koontz said. "I don't think it would any longer be wise to wait until morning." He looked at Tuttle, to whom clung snow in icy clumps. "What do you think?" "Agreed," Tuttle said. "But I suspect it's not going to be an easy journey. I wish I had all my senses up to full power." "We can still move fast," Koontz said. "And we don't need to rest, as fleshy creatures must. If we are pursued, we have the advantage." "In theory," Tuttle said. "We'll have to be satisfied with that." Koontz considered certain aspects of the myth. 7. He kills. 8. He can overpower a robot. In the lodge, by the eerie light of their hand torches, they bolted on their snowshoes, attached their emergency repair kits, and picked up their maps. The beams of their lamps preceding them, they went outside again, staying together. The wind beat upon their broad backs while the snow worked hard to coat them in hard-packed, icy suits. They crossed the clearing, half by dead reckoning and half by the few landmarks that the torches revealed, each wishing to himself that he had his full powers of sight and his radar back in operation again. Soon they came to the opening in the trees that led down the side of the valley and back toward Walker's Watch. They stopped there, staring into the dark tunnel formed by sheltering pines, and they seemed reluctant to go any farther. "There are so many shadows," Tuttle said. "Shadows can't hurt us," Koontz said. Throughout their association, from the moment they had met one another on the train coming north, Koontz had known that he was the leader among them. He had exercised his leadership sparingly, but now he must take full command. He started forward, into the trees, between the shadows, moving down the snowy slope. Reluctantly, Stefan followed. Tuttle came last. Halfway down toward the valley floor, the tunnel between the trees narrowed drastically. The trees loomed closer, spread their boughs lower. And it was here, in these tight quarters, in the deepest shadows, that they were attacked. Something howled in triumph, its mad voice echoing above the constant whine of the wind. Koontz whirled, not certain from which direction the sound had come, lancing the trees with torchlight. Behind, Tuttle cried out. Koontz turned as Stefan did, and their torches illuminated the struggling robot. "It can't be," Stefan said. Tuttle had fallen back under the relentless attack of a two-legged creature that moved almost as a robot might move, though it was clearly an animal. It was dressed in furs, its feet booted, and it wielded a metal axe. It drove the blunted blade at Tuttle's ring cable. Tuttle raised an arm, threw back the weapon, saved himself, at the cost of his severely damaged elbow joint. Koontz started forward to help, but was stopped as a second of the fleshy beasts delivered a blow from behind. The weapon struck the center of Koontz's back and drove him to his knees. Koontz fell sideways, rolled, got to his feet in one well-coordinated maneuver. He turned quickly to confront his assailant. A fleshy face stared back at him from a dozen feet away, blowing steam in the cold air. It was framed in a fur-lined hood, a grotesque parody of a robot face. Its eyes were too small for visual receptors, and they did not glow. Its face was not perfectly symmetrical as it should have been. It was out of proportion, also puffed and mottled from the cold. It did not even shine in the torchlight. And yet, obvious intelligence abided there. No doubt malevolent intelligence, perhaps even maniacal, but intelligence nonetheless. Surprisingly, the monster spoke to Koontz. Its voice was deep, its language full of rounded, softened syllables, not at all like the clattering language the robots spoke to one another. Abruptly, the beast leaped forward, crying out, and swung a length of metal pipe at Koontz's neck. The robot danced backward out of range. The demon came forward. Koontz glanced at the others and saw that the first demon had backed Tuttle almost into the woods. A third had attacked Stefan, who was barely managing to hold his own. Screaming, the man before Koontz charged, plowed the end of the pipe into Koontz's chest. The robot fell hard. The man came in close, raising his bludgeon. Man thinks, though he's of flesh, sleeps as an animal sleeps, devours other flesh, defecates, rots, dies. He spawns his young in an unmechanical manner, although his young are sentient. He kills. He overpowers robots, dismantles them, and does monstrous things. What? With their parts. He can be killed permanently only with a wooden implement, and if killed in any other manner, he does not die a true death, but at once springs up elsewhere, in a new body. As the monster swung his club, Koontz rolled, rose, and struck out with his long-fingered hand. The man's face tore, gave blood. The demon stepped back, bewildered. Koontz's terror had changed into rage. He stepped forward and struck out again, and again. Flailing with all his reduced strength, he broke the demon's body, temporarily killed it, leaving the snow spattered with blood. Turning from his own assailant, he moved on the beast that was after Stefan. Clubbing it from behind, he broke its neck with one blow of his steel hand. By the time Koontz reached Tuttle and dispatched the third demon, Tuttle had sustained one totally demolished arm, another smashed hand, and damage to the ring cable that, luckily, had not terminated him. With any luck, the three robots would survive. "I thought I was finished," Tuttle said. Dazed, Stefan said to Koontz, "You killed all three of them." "They would have terminated us," Koontz said. Inside, where they could not see, he was in turmoil. Stefan said, "But the prime directive from the Central Agency forbids the taking of life." "Not quite," Koontz disagreed. "It forbids the taking of life which cannot be restored." "Which cannot be restored." "These lives will be restored?" Stefan asked, looking at the hideous corpses, unable to understand. "You've seen human beings now," Koontz said. "Do you believe the myths, or do you still scoff?" "How can I scoff?" "Then," Koontz said, "if you believe that such demons exist, you must believe what else is said of them." He quoted his own store of data on the subject. "If killed in any other way, by any means other than wood, the man will only appear to be dead. In reality, the moment he drops before his assailant, he springs at once to life elsewhere, unharmed, in a new body." Stefan nodded, unwilling to argue the point. Tuttle said, "What now?" "We continue back to Walker's Watch," Koontz said. "And tell them what we found?" "No." "But," Tuttle said, We can lead them back here. Show them these carcasses. Look around you, Kurinov said. Other demons are watching from the trees. A dozen hateful white faces could be seen, leering. Kurinov said, I don't think they'll attack us again. They've seen what we can do, how we have learned that, with them, the Prime Directive does not apply. But they're sure to remove and bury the bodies when we've gone. We can take a carcass along with us, Tuttle said. Kurinov said, No. Both of your hands are useless. Stefan's right arm is uncontrollable. I couldn't carry one of those bodies all by myself as far as Walker's Watch, not with my power reduced as it is. Then, Tuttle said, we still won't tell anyone about what we've seen up here? We can't afford to, if we ever want to be promoted, Kurinov said. Our only hope is to spend a long time in some inactivation nook, contemplating until we've learned to cope with what we've witnessed. They picked their torches out of the snow and, staying close to one another, started down toward the valley once more. Walk slowly and show no fear, Kurinov warned. They walked slowly, but each was certain that his fear was evident to the unearthly creatures crouching in the shadows beneath the pine trees. They walked all that long night, and most of the following day, before they reached the station house at Walker's Watch. In that time, the storm died out. The landscape was serene, white, peaceful. Surveying the rolling snowfields, one felt sure that the universe was rational. But Kurinov was haunted by one icy realization. If he must believe in specters and other worldly beings like men, then he would never again be able to think of the universe in rational terms.
This audiobook has been broken into multiple parts to make the download faster. You have reached the end of a part, but not the end of the complete audiobook. So please check your library for the next part of this audiobook.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.
This is Audible.
Brilliance Audio presents the unabridged recording of Wilderness and Other Stories by Dean Koontz. Performed by Dick Hill, MacLeod Andrews, Will Dameron, and Tanya Eby.
Miss Attila the Hun. One. Through frost and thaw, through wet and dry seasons, the thing on the forest floor had waited many hundreds of years for a chance to live again. Not that it was dead. It was alive, aware, always alert to the passage of warm-blooded creatures in the dense woods around it. But only a small portion of its mind was required to monitor nearby animals for a possible host, while for the most part it was occupied with vivid dreams of previous ancient lives that it had led on other worlds. Deer, bears, badgers, squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, possums, wolves, mice, foxes, raccoons, cougars, quail that had strayed in from the fields, dogs, toads, chameleons, snakes, worms, beetles, spiders, and centipedes had passed near enough to the thing to have been seized if they had been suitable. Some, of course, were not warm-blooded, which was one of the creature's primary requirements of a host. Those that did have warm blood, the mammals and the birds, did not meet the other important requirement, a high order of intelligence. The thing did not grow impatient. It had found hosts in one form or another for millions upon millions of years. It was confident that it would eventually have an opportunity to ascend from its cold dreams and experience this new world, as it had experienced and conquered many others. 2. Jamie Whatley was in love with Mrs. Caswell. He had considerable artistic talent, so he filled a tablet with drawings of his dream woman, Mrs. Caswell riding a wild horse, Mrs. Caswell taming a lion, Mrs. Caswell shooting a charging rhinoceros that was as big as a Mack truck, Mrs. Caswell as the Statue of Liberty, holding a torch high. He had not seen her ride a horse, tame a lion, or shoot a rhino. Neither had he ever heard of her having performed any of those feats. And she certainly did not look like the Statue of Liberty. She was much prettier. But it seemed to Jamie that these imaginary scenes nevertheless portrayed the real Mrs. Caswell. He wanted to ask Mrs. Caswell to marry him, although he was not confident about his chances. For one thing, she was well educated and he was not. She was beautiful, and he was homely. She was funny and outgoing, but he was shy. She was so sure of herself, in command of any situation. Remember the school fire back in September, when she single-handedly saved the building from burning to the ground? While Jamie had difficulty coping with even minor crises. She was already married, too, and Jamie felt guilty about wishing her husband dead. But if he were to have any hope at all of marrying Mrs. Caswell, the worst problem to be overcome was the difference in their ages. She was 17 years older than Jamie, who was only 11. That Sunday night in late October, Jamie sat at the plank-topped makeshift desk in his small bedroom, creating a new pencil drawing of Mrs. Caswell, his 6th-grade teacher. He depicted her in their classroom, standing beside her desk, dressed in the white robes of an angel. A wonderful light radiated from her, and all the kids, Jamie's classmates, were smiling at her. Jamie put himself into the picture, 2nd row from the door, 1st desk, and, after some thought, he drew streams of small hearts rising from him, the way fog rose from a block of dry ice. Jamie Whatley, whose mother was an alcoholic slattern, and whose father was an alcoholic, frequently unemployed mechanic, had never much cared for school until this year, when he had fallen under the spell of Mrs. Laura Caswell. Now, Sunday night was always the slowest night of the week, because he was impatient for the start of school. Downstairs, his mean-spirited, drunken father was arguing with his equally drunken mother. The subject was money, but the argument could as easily have been about the inedible dinner she had prepared, his eye for other women, her sloppy appearance, his poker losses, her constant whining, the lack of snack foods in the house, or which TV program they were going to watch. The thin walls of the decrepit house did little to muffle their voices, but Jamie was usually able to tune them out. He started a new drawing. In this one, Mrs. Caswell was standing on a rocky landscape, wearing futuristic clothing, and battling an alien monster with a laser sword. 3. Before dawn, Teal Cleaver drove his battered, dirty, 8-year-old Jeep station wagon into the hills. He parked along an abandoned logging road deep in the forest. As dawn was breaking, he set out on foot with his deer rifle. The gun was a bolt-action Winchester Model 70 and .270 caliber, restocked in fine European walnut, with a 4-power scope on Stith streamline mounts, incorporating windage. Teal loved the woods at dawn, the velvety softness of the shadows, the clear early light spearing down through the branches, the lingering smell of night dampness. He took great satisfaction from the feel of the rifle in his hand, and from the thrill of the hunt. But most of all, he enjoyed poaching. Although he was the most successful real estate wheeler and dealer in the county, a man of position and modest wealth, Teal was loath to spend $1 when the same item could be had elsewhere for 98 cents, and he refused to spend a penny when he could get what he wanted for free. He had owned a farm on the northeast edge of Pine Ridge, the county seat, where the state had decided to put the new turnpike interchange, and he'd made better than $600,000 in profit by selling off pieces to motel and fast food chains. That was the biggest of his deals, but far from the only one. He would have been a rich man without it. Yet he bought a new Jeep wagon only every 10 years, owned 1 suit, and was notorious at Pine Ridge's Acme supermarket for spending as much as 3 hours comparison shopping to save 80 cents on one order of groceries. He never bought beef. Why pay for meat when the woods were full of it, on the hoof, free for the taking? Teal was 53. He had been shooting deer out of season since he was 17, and he had never been caught. He had never particularly liked the taste of venison, and after having eaten uncounted thousands of pounds of the stuff over the past 3.5 decades, he sometimes didn't look forward to dinner. However, his appetite always improved when he thought of all the money that he had kept in his pocket and out of the hands of cattle farmers, beef brokers, and members of the Butchers' Union. After 40 minutes of climbing the gently sloped, forested foothills without spotting deer spoor, Teal paused for a rest on a large flat rock between two big cone pines. After he sat on the edge of the rock and put his rifle aside, he noticed something odd in the ground between his booted feet. The object was half buried in the soft, moist black soil. It was also partly covered by decaying brown pine needles. He reached down with one hand and brushed the needles away. The thing was the shape of a football, but appeared to be about twice as large. The surface was highly polished, as glossy as a ceramic glaze, and Teal knew the object must be man-made, because no amount of wind and water abrasion could produce such a sheen. The thing was darkly mottled blue and black and green, and it had a strange beauty. He was about to get off the rock, drop to his hands and knees, and dig the mysterious object out of the soil, when holes opened in several places across its surface. In the same instant, black and glossy plant-like tendrils exploded toward him. Some whipped around his head and neck, others around his arms, still others around his feet. In 3 seconds, he was snared. "Seed," he thought frantically. "Some crazy damn kind of seed no one's seen before." He struggled violently, but he could not pull free of the black tendrils or break them. He could not even get up from the rock or move an inch to one side or the other. He tried to scream, but the thing had clamped his mouth shut. Because Teal was still looking straight down between his legs at the nightmarish seed, he saw a new, larger hole dilate in the center of it. A much thicker tendril, a stalk, really, rose swiftly out of the opening and came toward his face as if it were a cobra swaying up from a snake charmer's basket. Black, with irregular midnight blue spots, tapered at the top. It terminated in 9 thin, writhing tendrils. Those feelers explored his face with a spider-soft touch, and he shuddered in revulsion. Then the stalk moved away from his face, curved toward his chest, and with horror he felt it growing with amazing rapidity through his clothes, through his skin, through his breastbone, and into his body cavity. He felt the 9 tendrils spreading through him, and then he fainted before he could go insane. 4. On this world, its name was Seed. At least that was what it saw in the mind of its first host. It was not actually a plant, nor an animal in fact, but it accepted the name that Teal Pleaver gave it. Seed extruded itself entirely from the pod in which it had waited for hundreds of years, and inserted all of its mass into the body of the host. Then it closed up the bloodless wounds by which it had entered Pleaver. It required 10 minutes of exploration to learn more about human physiology than humans knew. For one thing, humans apparently didn't understand that they had the ability to heal themselves and to daily repair the effects of aging. They lived short lives, oddly unaware of their potential for immortality. Something had happened during the species' evolution to create a mind-body barrier that prevented them from consciously controlling their own physical being. Strange. Sitting on the rock between the pine trees, in the body of Teal Pleaver, Seed took an additional 18 minutes to acquire a full understanding of the depth, breadth, and workings of the human mind. It was one of the most interesting minds that Seed had encountered anywhere in the universe. Complex, powerful, distinctly psychotic. This was going to be an interesting incarnation. Seed rose from the rock, picked up the rifle that belonged to its host, and headed down the forested hills toward the place where Teal Pleaver had parked the jeep wagon. Seed had no interest in deer poaching. 5. Jack Caswell sat at the kitchen table, watching his wife as she got ready for school that Monday morning, and he knew beyond a doubt that he was the luckiest man in the world. Laura was so lovely, slender, long-limbed, and shapely that Jack sometimes felt as if he were dreaming his life rather than actually living it, for surely in the real world he would not have merited a woman like Laura. She took her brown plaid scarf from one of the hooks by the back door and wrapped it around her neck, crossing the fringed ends over her breasts. Peering through the half-steamed window in the door, she read the outside temperature on the big thermometer mounted on the porch. 38 degrees, and it's only the end of October. Her thick, soft, shiny chestnut brown hair framed a perfectly proportioned face reminiscent of the old movie star Veronica Lake. She had enormous, expressive eyes, so dark brown that they were almost black. They were the clearest, most direct eyes that Jack had ever seen. He doubted that anyone could look into those eyes and lie, or fail to love the woman behind them. Removing her old brown cloth coat from another hook, slipping into it, closing the buttons, she said, "We'll have snow well before Thanksgiving this year, I'll bet, and the whitest Christmas in ages, and we'll be snowbound by January." "Wouldn't mind being snowbound with you for maybe 6 or 8 months, he said. "Just the two of us, snow up to the roof, so we'd have to stay in bed under the covers, sharing body heat to survive." Grinning, she came to him, bent and kissed him on the cheek. "Jackson," she said, using her pet name for him, "the way you turn me on, we'd generate so darn much body heat that it wouldn't matter if the snow was a mile higher than the roof. Regardless of how cold it was outside, it'd be sweltering in here. Temperature and humidity over 100 degrees, jungle plants growing out of the floorboards, vines crawling up the walls, tropical molds in all the corners." She went into the living room to get the briefcase that was on the desk at which she planned her school lessons. Jack got up from the table. A little stiffer than usual this morning, but still in good enough shape to shuffle around without his cane. He gathered up the dirty breakfast dishes. He was still thinking about what a lucky man he was. She could have had any guy she wanted, yet she had chosen a husband with no better than average looks, and with 2 bum legs that wouldn't hold him up if he didn't clamp them in metal braces every morning. With her looks, personality, and intelligence, she could have married rich, or could have gone off to the big city to make her own fortune. Instead, she had settled for the simple life of a teacher and the wife of a struggling writer, passing up mansions for this small house at the edge of the woods, forgoing limousines for a 3-year-old Toyota. When she bustled into the kitchen with her briefcase, Jack was putting the dishes in the sink. "Do you miss the limousines?" She blinked at him. "What are you talking about?" He sighed and leaned against the counter. "Sometimes I worry that maybe—" She came to him. "That maybe what?" "Well, that you don't have much in life. Certainly not as much as you ought to have. Laura, you were born for limousines, mansions, ski chalets in Switzerland. You deserve them." She smiled. "You sweet, silly man. I'd be bored in a limousine. I like to drive. It's fun to drive. Heck, if I lived in a mansion, I'd rattle around like a pea in a barrel. I like cozy places. Since I don't ski, chalets aren't any use to me. And though I like their clocks and chocolates, I can't abide the way the Swiss yodel all the time." He put his hands on her shoulders. "Are you really happy?" She looked directly into his eyes. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "I worry that I can't give you enough." "Listen, Jackson, you love me with all your heart, and I know you do. I feel it all the time, and it's a love that most women will never experience. I'm happier with you than I ever thought I could be. And I enjoy my work, too. Teaching is immensely satisfying if you really try to jam knowledge into those little demons. Besides, you'll be famous someday, the most famous writer of detective novels since Raymond Chandler. I just know it. Now, if you don't stop being a total booby, I'm going to be late for work." She kissed him again, went to the door, blew him another kiss, went outside, and descended the porch steps to the Toyota, parked in the gravel driveway. He grabbed his cane from the back of one of the kitchen chairs and used it to move more quickly to the door than he could have with only the assistance of his leg braces. Wiping the steam from the cold pane of glass, he watched her start the car and race the engine until, warmed up, it stopped knocking. Clouds of vapor plumed from the exhaust pipe. She drove out to the county road and off toward the elementary school 3 miles away. Jack stayed at the window until the white Toyota had dwindled to a speck and vanished. Though Laura was the strongest and most self-assured person Jack had ever known, he worried about her. The world was hard, full of nasty surprises, even here in the rural piece of Pine County. And people, including the toughest of them, could get ground up suddenly by the wheels of fate, crushed and broken in the blink of an eye. "You take care of yourself," he said softly. "You take care, and come back to me." 6. Seed drove Teal Pleaver's battered old Jeep wagon to the end of the abandoned logging road and turned right onto a narrow blacktop lane. In a mile, the hills descended into flatter land, and the forest gave way to open fields. At the first dwelling, Seed stopped and got out of the Jeep. Drawing upon its host's store of knowledge, Seed discovered this was the Hallowell place. At the front door, it knocked sharply. Mrs. Hallowell, a 30-ish woman with amiable features, answered the knock. She was drying her hands on her blue and white checkered apron. "Why, Mr. Pleaver, isn't it?" Seed extruded tendrils from its host's fingertips. The swift black lashes whipped around the woman, pinning her. As Mrs. Hallowell screamed, a much thicker stalk burst from Pleaver's open mouth, shot straight to the woman, and bloodlessly pierced her chest, fusing with her flesh as it entered her. She never finished her first scream. Seed took control of her in seconds. The tendrils and stalks linking the two hosts parted in the middle, and the glistening blue-spotted black alien substance flowed partly back into Teal Pleaver and partly into Jane Hallowell. Seed was growing. Searching Jane Hallowell's mind, Seed learned that her 2 young children had gone to school, and that her husband had taken the pickup into Pine Ridge to make a few purchases at the hardware store. She had been alone in the house. Eager to acquire new hosts and expand its empire, Seed took Jane and Teal out to the Jeep wagon and drove back onto the narrow lane, heading toward the county road that led into Pine Ridge. 7. Mrs. Caswell always began the morning with a history lesson. Until he had landed in her 6th grade class, Jamie Whatley had thought that he didn't like history, that it was dull. When Mrs. Caswell taught history, however, it wasn't only interesting, but fun. Sometimes she made them act out roles in great historical events, and each of them got to wear a funny hat suitable to the character he was portraying. Mrs. Caswell had the most amazing collection of funny hats. Once, when teaching a lesson about the Vikings, she had walked into the room wearing a horned helmet, and everyone had busted a gut laughing. At first, Jamie had been a bit embarrassed for her. She was his Mrs. Caswell, after all, the woman he loved, and he couldn't bear to see her behaving foolishly. But then she showed them paintings of Viking longboats with intricately carved dragons on the prows, and she began to describe what it was like to be a Viking sailing unknown misty seas in the ancient days, before there were maps, heading out into unknown waters where, as far as people of that time knew, you might actually meet up with dragons, or even fall off the edge of the earth. And as she talked, her voice grew softer, softer, until everyone was leaning forward, until it seemed as if they were transported from their classroom onto the deck of a small ship, with storm waves crashing all around them, and a mysterious dark shore looming out of the wind and rain ahead. Now Jamie had 10 drawings of Mrs. Caswell as a Viking, and they were among his favorites in his secret gallery. Last week, a teaching evaluator named Mr. Enright had monitored a day of Mrs. Caswell's classes. He was a neat little man in a dark suit, white shirt, and red bow tie. After the history lesson, which had been about life in medieval times, Mr. Enright wanted to question the kids to see how much they grasped of what they had been taught. Jamie and the others were eager to answer, and Enright was impressed.
"But, Mrs. Caswell," he said, "you're not exactly teaching them the 6th grade level, are you? This seems more like about 8th grade material to me."
Ordinarily, the class would have reacted positively to Enright's statement, seizing on the implied compliment. They would have sat up straight at their desks, puffed out their chests, and smiled smugly. But they had been coached to react differently if this situation arose, so they slumped in their chairs and tried to look exhausted. Mrs. Caswell said, "Class, what Mr. Enright means is that he's afraid I'm pushing you too fast, too hard. You don't think that I demand too much of you?" The entire class answered with one voice, "Yes!" Mrs. Caswell pretended to look startled. "Oh, now, I don't overwork you." Melissa Fetter, who had the enviable ability to cry on cue, burst into tears, as if the strain of being one of Mrs. Caswell's students were just too much to bear. Jamie stood, shaking in make-believe terror, and delivered his one speech with practiced emotion. "Mr. Enright, we can't take it anymore. She never lets up on us. Never. We call her Miss Attila the Hun." Other kids began to voice rehearsed complaints to Mr. Enright. "Never gives us a recess. 4 hours of homework every night. Too much. Only 6th graders." Mr. Enright was genuinely appalled. Mrs. Caswell stepped toward the class, scowling, and made a short chopping motion with her hand. Everyone instantly fell silent, as if afraid of her. Melissa Fetter was still crying, and Jamie worked hard at making his lower lip tremble.
"Mrs. Caswell," Mr. Enright said uneasily, well, perhaps you should consider sticking closer to the 6th grade texts. The stress created by—"
"Oh," Mrs. Caswell said, feigning horror. "I'm afraid it's too late, Mr. Enright. Look at the poor dears. I'm afraid I've worked them to death." At this cue, all the kids in the class fell forward on their desks, as if they had collapsed and died. Mr. Enright stood in startled silence for a moment, then broke into laughter, and all the kids laughed too, and Mr. Enright said, "Mrs. Caswell, you set me up. This was staged." "I confess," she said, and the kids laughed harder.
"But how did you know I'd be concerned about your pushing them past 6th grade material?"
"Because everyone always underestimates kids," Mrs. Caswell said. "The approved curriculum never challenges them. Everyone worries so much about psychological stress, the problems associated with being an overachiever, and the result is that kids are actually encouraged to be underachievers. But I know kids, Mr. Enright, and I tell you they're a much tougher, smarter bunch than anyone gives them credit for being. Am I right?" The class loudly assured her that she was right. Mr. Enright surveyed the class, pausing to study each child's face, and it was the first time all morning that he had really looked at them. At last he smiled.
"Mrs. Caswell, this is a wonderful thing you've got going here."
"Thank you," said Mrs. Caswell. Mr. Enright shook his head, smiled more broadly, and winked.
"Miss Attila the Hun, indeed."
At that moment, Jamie was so proud of Mrs. Caswell and so in love with her that he had to struggle valiantly to repress tears far more genuine than those of Melissa Fetter. Now, on the last Monday morning in October, Jamie listened to Miss Attila the Hun as she told them what medical science was like in the Middle Ages, crude, and what alchemy was, lead into gold, and all sorts of crazy, fascinating stuff. And, in a while, he could no longer smell the chalk dust and child scents of the classroom, but could almost smell the terrible, reeking, sewage-spattered streets of medieval Europe. 8. In his 10-foot square office at the front of the house, Jack Caswell sat at an ancient pine desk, sipping coffee and rereading the chapter he'd written the previous day. He made a lot of pencil corrections and then switched on his computer to enter the changes. In the 3 years since his accident, Unable to return to work as a game warden for the Department of Forestry, he had struggled to fulfill his lifelong desire to be a writer. Sometimes, in his dreams, he could still see the big truck starting to slide on the ice-covered road, and he felt his own car entering a sickening spin too, and the bright headlights were bearing down on him, and he pumped the brake pedal, turned the wheel into the slide, but he was always too late. Even in the dreams, he was always too late. He had written 4 fast-paced detective novels in the last 3 years, 2 of which had sold to New York publishers, and he had also placed 8 short stories in magazines. Until Laura came along, his 2 great loves had been the outdoors and books. Before the accident, he had often hiked miles up into the mountains, to places remote and serene, with his backpack half filled with food, half with paperbacks. Augmenting his supplies with berries and nuts and edible roots, he had remained for days in the wilderness, alternately studying the wildlife and reading. He was equally a man of nature and civilization. Though it was difficult to bring nature into town, it was easy to carry civilization, in the form of books, into the wild heart of the forest, allowing him to satisfy both halves of his cleft soul. These days, cursed with legs that would never again support him on a journey into the hills, he had to be content with the pleasures of civilization. And damn it, he soon had to make a better living with his writing than he had managed thus far. From the sales of 8 stories and 2 well-reviewed novels spread over 3 years, he had not earned a third as much as Laura's modest teaching salary. He was a long way from reaching the bestseller lists, and life at the lower end of the publishing business was far from glamorous. Without his small disability pension from the Department of Forestry, he and Laura would have had serious difficulty keeping themselves housed, clothed, and fed. When he remembered the worn brown cloth coat in which Laura had gone off to school that morning, he grew sad. But the thought of her in that drab coat also made him more determined than ever to write a breakthrough book, earn a fortune, and buy her the luxuries that she deserved. The strange thing was that if he had not been in the accident, he would not have met Laura, would not have married her. She'd been at the hospital visiting a sick student, and on the way out she had seen Jack in the hall. He was in a wheelchair, sullenly roaming the corridors. Laura was incapable of passing an obviously depressed man in a wheelchair without attempting to cheer him. Filled with self-pity and anger, he rebuffed her. However, rejection only made Laura try harder. He didn't know what a bulldog she was, but he learned. 2 days later, when she returned to visit her student, she paid a call on Jack as well, and soon she was coming every day just to see him. When he resigned himself to life in a wheelchair, Laura insisted that he work longer and harder with a therapist every day, and that he at least try to learn to walk with braces and a cane. After some time, when the therapist had only moderate success with him, Laura wheeled him, protesting, into the therapy room every day, and put him through the exercises a second time. Before long, her indomitable spirit and optimism infected Jack. He became determined to walk again, and then he did walk, and somehow learning to walk led to love and marriage. So the worst thing that had ever happened to him, the leg-crushing collision, had brought him to Laura, and she was far and away the best thing that had ever happened to him. Screwy. Life sure was screwy. In the new novel on which he was working, he was trying to write about that screwiness, the bizarre way that bad things could lead to blessings, while blessings sometimes ended in tragedy. If he could thread that observation through a detective story in such a way as to explore the more profound aspects of it, he might be able to write not only a big-money book, but also a book of which he could be proud. He poured another cup of coffee, and was about to start a new chapter when he looked out the window to the left of his desk and saw a dirty, dented Jeep station wagon pull off the county road into his driveway. Wondering who could be calling, he immediately levered himself up from the chair and grabbed his cane. He needed time to get to the front door, and he hated to keep people waiting. He saw the Jeep stop in front of the house. Both doors flew open, and a man and a woman got out. Jack recognized the man, Teal Pleaver, whom he knew slightly. Just about everyone in Pine County knew Pleaver. But Jack figured that, like him, most folks didn't really know the man well. The woman was vaguely familiar to him. She was about 30, attractive, and he thought perhaps she had a child in Laura's class, and that he had seen her at a school function. In only a house dress and an apron, she was not properly clothed for the chilly October morning. By the time Jack caned halfway across the office, his visitors had begun to knock on the front door. 9. Seed pulled off the highway as soon as it saw the next dwelling. After centuries of dreamy half-life, it was eager to expand into more hosts. From Pleaver, it knew that 5,000 people lived in the town of Pine Ridge, in which Seed intended to arrive by noon. Within 2 days, 3 at most, it would assume control of every one of the town's citizens, and then would spread throughout Pine County, until it seized the bodies and imprisoned the minds of all 20,000 residents in that entire rural area. Although spread among many hosts, Seed remained a single entity with a single consciousness. It could live simultaneously in tens of millions or even billions of hosts, absorbing sensory input from billions of eyes and billions of ears and billions of noses, mouths, and hands, without risking confusion or information overload. In its countless millions of years of drifting through the galaxies, on the more than 100 planets where it had thrived, Seed had never encountered another creature with its unique talent for physical schizophrenia. Now it took its 2 captives out of the jeep and marched them across the lawn to the front porch steps of the small white house. From Pine County, it would send its hosts outward, fanning across this continent, then to others, until every human being on the face of the earth had been claimed. Throughout this period, it would destroy neither the mind nor the individual personality of any host, but would imprison each while it used the host's body and store of knowledge to facilitate its conquest of the world. Teal Pleaver, Jane Hallowell, and all the others would be horribly aware during their months of total enslavement, aware of the world around them, aware of the monstrous acts they were committing, and aware of Seed nesting within them. It walked its 2 hosts up the porch steps and used Pleaver to knock loudly on the front door. When no man, woman, or child on Earth remained free, Seed would advance to the next stage, the day of release, abruptly allowing its hosts to resume control of their bodies, though in each of them would remain an aspect of the puppet master, always gazing out through their eyes and monitoring their thoughts. By the day of release, of course, at least half of the hosts would be insane. Others, having